The popularity of podcasts has really taken off in recent years. According to Forbes, there's over 400 million podcast listeners who tune in for all sorts of content. Gaming, music, sports, you name it. It's easier than ever to make your voice be heard to the general public. With NASCAR, it's no different. I listened to quite a few NASCAR podcasts over the years, and honestly, I haven't found one I dislike yet. Oh wait, never mind, I did. But yeah, other than that, all of the NASCAR podcasts I've listened to have ranged from decent to great. In today's video, I want to list off my 5 favorite NASCAR podcasts. I'm going to list off positives and negatives, even though I don't have too many negatives with these podcasts since these are my favorites after all. But they're not perfect, and I feel like each podcast do have room for improvement. So let's get it. Starting off with number 5, Actions Detrimental. When I heard Denny Hamlin was starting a podcast, I ain't gonna lie, I was too geeked up. When you got one of the most outspoken drivers in the sport currently starting a podcast, yeah, it's gonna get someone like me excited. Say what you want about Hamlin, but his podcast is pretty damn good. He's very insightful and gives a great perspective of what it's like not only to be a cup driver, but a team owner as well. Each episode you learn something new, and it makes this podcast one of the most informative out there. It's pretty clear how passionate he is about the sport and wants it to succeed and thrive going forward. Everyone thinks Denny just comes on this podcast and complains for an hour and that's it. But that's not the case. Yes, Hamlin could be a hypocrite at times, but the podcast isn't him just talking out his ass the whole time. The co-host Jared Allen is his name, I think. He's a decent co-host, much better than some other co-hosts out there. A few negatives I do have is one, they skip Dear Denny sometimes, and if you don't know what I mean, it's a segment where Denny answers fan questions, which 90% of the time are really interesting questions. I wish they can consistently get to that segment every week. There's way too many advertisements, and this is a dirty mode issue in general. I'm not kidding when I say this. You're getting hit with at least 6 to 8 advertisements every show. It's frustrating. I get it, they need to sell advertisements, but goddamn. These podcasts are usually an hour long, and squeezing that many advertisements into an hour show is pretty ridiculous. Outside of those 2 negatives, Actions Detrimental is a really good podcast. For a first year podcast to make the top 5 on this list is pretty impressive, and hopefully they continue to improve it in the future. Number 4, the Dale Jr. Download. If you would have told me 10 to 15 years ago that Dale Jr. would be a host of a podcast and a commentator on TV, I wouldn't have believed you. Do y'all remember how bad Jr. used to be with interviews? It honestly still kind of surprises me that he's in the roles that he's in now, knowing how he used to be. Junior has turned himself into a hell of a podcast host though. The best thing about Junior is how great of a storyteller he is. He doesn't leave a single detail out. You can feel what he's saying and you can tell that it's genuine. Junior is like all of us, he's a fan. When he's giving his opinion on NASCAR, he ain't looking at it as an owner or a broadcaster, but just a fan. He likes rivalries and hopes to see more. He doesn't shy away from the problems that the sport has and tries to offer solutions. Listening to what Dale Jr. has to say in general is always a treat. The guests he's had on his podcast is mainly what makes his podcast so popular, and Jr. does such a great job asking the guests interesting questions, and most importantly, he lets them talk. It's so many podcast hosts that loves to interrupt the guests, and that shit pisses me off. Shut the fuck up and let the guests talk. That shit is irritating. I ain't gonna lie, I'll react like Kanye West if I kept getting cut off.
Yo, stop it, man. I'm talking, man. Keep on cutting me off, man. Are you serious?
But anyway, Junior does an excellent job with not cutting off the guests. And speaking of guests, he's had some amazing ones on there. And usually these guests will open up on the Dale Jr. Download. They'll reveal things that they never talked about before, and I just think it's because of how respectful Dale Jr. comes off towards the guests. I also like Ask Jr. where Dale Jr. will answer fan questions, and typically he gives you a very detailed answer, and it leads to stories which I definitely don't mind. The negatives with this podcast, just like Actions Detrimental, is too many advertisements. But like I said, that's a dirty mode issue. There's only one other negative, and that's the co-host Mike Davis. He adds nothing to the show, and I could definitely do without him. The main thing about Mike Davis is that he's at his worst with the guests. He derails a good conversation constantly, and he'll restate previous points made by others word for word, and it's aggravating. I feel like half of the time he's not even paying attention to the guests because he'll ask them something that they already talked about. When he interrupts guests, it doesn't just pisses me off, but the guests themselves, and you can tell just how the way they look at Mike Davis and how they'll respond to him. I think he was at his worst when Harvick was on there. Dale Jr. and Harvick had some issues. Harvick came on there to hopefully bury the hatchet and move on, and they did. But even after that, Mike kept coming in, rehashing how bad Jr. feelings were hurt. He just wouldn't let it go. This is between Kevin Harvick and Dale Jr. If Mike isn't personally over it, okay, keep it to yourself. This is the Dale Jr. download, not the Mike Davis download. If Mike Davis wasn't on this podcast, it would definitely be for the better. But overall, the Dale Jr. download is a really good podcast. It's too many positives about it that outweighs the negatives. Number 3, The Teardown. Probably a podcast you wouldn't expect to be this high on the list. The podcast is hosted by Jeff Gluck and he's joined by Jordan Bianchi, who are both writers for The Athletic. I think the main reason why I love this podcast is because you can get the inside scoop on things that's going on in the sport. When Adam Stern isn't breaking stories, it's usually Jordan Bianchi, and he usually reveals things regarding silly season, rules and format changes NASCAR is looking into, and etc. Jeff and Jordan do a great job breaking down the most recent races and all the storylines that's happening in NASCAR. I don't always agree with them on things, but that's fine. They can get off topic at times and talk about something random, but it usually doesn't bother me too much because I usually find it funny. The good race, bad race poll is interesting because they compete against each other, and it's always interesting to hear their guesses on what score the fans will give the race. I don't have too many negatives to say about this podcast. I think the only thing that bothers me is when a bad race happens, they act all doom and gloom about it. But other than that, it's not much I can say that's negative about it. I think if you want to get the inside scoop on things about the sport, The Teardown is a podcast I definitely recommend. Coming in at number 2 is a podcast that actually doesn't exist anymore. The last episode of it aired on February 22nd in 2022, and that's Positive Regression. I'm just getting sad thinking about it. Positive Regression was a motorsports analytics podcast hosted by Alan Cavanna and co-hosted by David Smith. It was a podcast where Alan and David dive deep into data about drivers and teams that typically doesn't get talked about. You always hear about wins, top 5s, top 10s, average finish, laps led, but what you don't hear about is median lap rank, restart retention rate, surplus passing value, and so much more. It's data that tells the real story about a driver and the car, and honestly, more fans need to know more about these analytics. I absolutely love statistics, so I love data like this. Alan Cavanna knows his stuff and does a great job being the host, but David Smith is honestly the star of the podcast because he's the one that brings all of this data to the table. If you're not familiar with David Smith, he's a NASCAR driver talent scout on behalf of 3 different sports agencies. With someone that has all of this data in front of them, they could be very valuable to a team, and RFK is one of the teams that noticed this and hired him as head of analytics for the team. And for that reason, it's why Positive Regression came to an end. I'm happy for David Smith, but damn, it sucks not being able to hear him explain the data that he gathers and to share with us on a week-to-week basis. There's no negatives with this podcast. It's honestly nothing to complain about. Who can dislike a podcast like this where you're consuming so much data that is given to you? It's making you a smarter NASCAR fan at the end of the day. Positive Regression will be missed. Before I get to number 1 on this list, I just want to bring up an honorable mention. One podcast that I was close to putting on this list, and that's Door Bumper Clear. Yes, I was considering putting this in the top 5, but it's some things about this podcast that bothers me and makes it just miss the cut. So if you don't know what this podcast is, it's 3 NASCAR spotters that pretty much give their opinion about everything that's going on in the sport. TJ Majors, Freddie Kraft, and Brett Griffin. I like how outspoken they are, and they usually don't hold back, which is what I always like, but these guys are really biased at times. When their driver is involved in something, they're biased. And that's kind of irritating because yes, I get that you spot for them, but if you take up for your driver at all costs no matter what, it's like, come on man, I can't take you seriously at this point. I seen Dale Jr. call his drivers out when calling the Xfinity races. It's nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying you have to talk shit about your driver, but if they fuck up badly, don't be afraid to call them out on it. You don't have to absolutely destroy them on the podcast, but just disagree is all I'm asking, especially if it's pretty clear that your driver messed up, whether it was something he or she did on track or something they said. Brett Griffin is an odd case. This dude is absolutely hilarious, but at the same time, he's frustrating to listen to at times. Sometimes he says the most off the wall stuff and I just can't help but laugh, but his takes on things is infuriating. Sometimes he'll give his opinion on things and it's pretty clear that he doesn't have all the facts about something and he just comes off as misinformed. How the way he tries to present himself, he tries to make it seem like he knows what he's talking about, but it's been so many times where he clearly doesn't. Yes, he's an experienced spotter, I'm not about to question him on that, but it's so many other things where he's kinda off base. There is positives to the show. Like I said, I like how outspoken they are for the most part. Casey Bolt is a good host, unlike Mike Davis. I love reaction theater, which honestly is the best part of the show because NASCAR fans be saying some of the most funniest shit ever. You got fans sending in audio clips to the podcast and usually they're talking shit about the race, the drivers, the guys on the podcast, and even sending in songs that they made. It's funny as hell, and to be honest, it's one of the best segments of the show in my opinion. If this was a top 10 list, DBC would have been around 6, but this is a top 5 list, so they just missed being on there. Now, it's time for my number 1. My favorite NASCAR podcast, the podcast I look forward to the most every week, the NASCAR Weekly Podcast. Oh shit, NASCAR Reddit is in shambles. Nah, but real talk though, this has been one of my favorite NASCAR podcasts for quite a while now. I actually been watching these guys since they first started this whole deal. The Iceberg, Eric Estepp, Black Flags Matter, and DannyBTalks. 4 popular NASCAR YouTubers coming together to host a podcast, and say what you want about these guys, but they do a great job. They know what they're talking about and they play a little bit of a role in getting a younger demographic engaged in NASCAR, which is very important. The best part about this podcast is the community engagement. These guys constantly get the community involved through the chat, super chats, the race polls, and the NWP Fantasy League. They always make sure to include the community, and I think I can speak for everyone when I say we really appreciate that. There's no other podcast that is engaged with their viewers like the NASCAR Weekly Podcast. These guys speak their minds, and for the most part, they are professional with how they present the podcast. What I don't mind at all is them going off the rails, and that has happened at times, and it's actually pretty hilarious. When that podcast is approaching the 3-hour mark, these guys start tweaking, but it's funny as hell. They've had plenty of guests on their podcast from small YouTubers, big time YouTubers, Cup, Xfinity trucks, and ARCA drivers, and even had the president of NASCAR, Steve Phelps, on their show. It's amazing how many intriguing guests they had on their show. I love every segment of the show, and even how a certain segment is introduced by Black Flags Matter.
But it's once again, it's the lightning round on the NASCAR Weekly Podcast.
That actually never gets old. And one last positive is that the intro to the podcast, which gets me excited. The music, graphics, and everything about it is fantastic. Shout out to JettMDK who made the intro for the podcast. Just like Positive Regression, I have nothing negative to say about this podcast. It's 2 hours of fun every week, and if you haven't checked it out, I really suggest you do. By the way, subscribe to these guys' channels. They all put out great content. So there's my top 5 NASCAR podcasts. I checked out plenty, and it's a few that I still have to get around to. Now, I want y'all to do me a favor. List off your top 5 NASCAR podcasts in the comments. I'm curious to see what y'all listen to. I'm gonna go ahead and roll up out of here. Y'all have a good one. Peace.